Pregnant young woman is humiliated on public transport for not having a ticket until a millionaire pays and announces something surprising. The crowded bus seemed to choke off every breath, and all eyes turned to the young woman with her already visible belly, trembling before the impatient driver. She rummaged through her empty pockets, her hands covered in dust, trying to find pennies that weren't there. The piercing silence of the morning was broken by muffled laughter, disapproving glances and cruel whispered comments from the passengers. "If you can't even pay the fare, how are you going to raise a child?" someone muttered loud enough to cut like a blade. Her cheeks burned, her eyes welled, and yet she kept her chin high, as if the shame wasn't enough to crush her. The driver was already gesturing for her to get off the bus, and the scene was turning into a public spectacle of humiliation, where every glance seemed heavier than her belly, laden with the future. It was. Then that a firm, unexpected voice echoed from behind, piercing the cruel silence like an arrow. "I'll pay her fare, and everyone's here if necessary." A tall, impeccably dressed man stood up from among the benches. The expensive watch on his wrist gleamed, but what was most striking was the serenity in his eyes. He walked to the front, handed a large bill to the driver, and said with a calm that made the room freeze, "Consider that today no one has to pay." The passengers glanced at each other, embarrassed. The man then looked at the young woman with a slight smile and added, "But above all, I hope you learn that dignity is priceless." Silence fell, now fraught with shame, but this time not for the pregnant young woman. Something had changed, and that scene, marked by contempt, had become a stage for silent, poetic justice. The New York morning had that peculiar grayness, mixed with the incessant blare of horns, hurried footsteps, and voices lost amid the concrete. The streets brimmed with haste, but also with indifference. Inside the bus, the routine continued as usual. Exhausted workers clutching grocery bags, students dozing with headphones on, ladies chatting about trivialities, and scattered glances, each enclosed in their own bubble. It was an urban setting where no one had time to see another, where lives intersected in seconds and were forgotten in minutes. It was into this suffocating environment that the young woman entered, carrying not only the weight of a growing belly but also the invisible mark of poverty and loneliness. Her hair was tied up haphazardly, her simple clothes already worn with use, and her eyes, though tired, held an almost defiant gleam, as if life had not yet managed to completely shatter her hope. She entered hesitantly, as if knowing that with every step she ran the risk of being judged, and she was right. The driver, a middle-aged man with a hardened expression, looked her up and down suspiciously. When she put her hands in her pockets and found nothing but emptiness, silence took over. It wasn't just physical silence, but that heavy silence where every glance becomes an accusation, every breath a judgment. Some passengers frowned, others smiled wryly, as if her suffering were cheap entertainment. And in the back a man sat alone watching the scene with attentive eyes. It was impossible not to notice the difference. While everyone else seemed to be enjoying the humiliation, he seemed interested in something beyond the surface. Dressed with discreet elegance, a tailored suit, a watch that could pay for months' rent for anyone there, he drew attention not only for his apparent wealth, but for the calm with which he faced everything. He didn't rush into action. He didn't allow himself to be swayed by the same collective poison that contaminated the air. The contrast between them was stark. On one side, a young woman struggling with shame and prejudice, trying to maintain a shred of dignity even in the face of public exposure. On the other, a man surrounded by symbols of power, accustomed to seeing the world bow before his money. But what no one knew was that on that ordinary morning, on that ordinary bus, something extraordinary was about to happen. The atmosphere was charged with tension, as if the universe were about to turn the page on a destiny previously written in suffering. Every detail seemed to amplify the feeling that this would not be just another trip. Dust danced in the beams of light. Streaming through the windows, heavy gazes continued to pierce the young woman like invisible spears, and yet there was a silent force hovering, a harbinger that everything would change in a matter of seconds. From a young age, her life was never fair. She grew up in a cramped house in the suburbs of New Jersey, where rain dripped through the cracks in the roof and the cold crept in without asking for permission. Her father had disappeared when she was still a toddler, and her mother, overwhelmed by a routine of low-paying jobs, carried in her eyes the exhaustion of someone who never had time to dream. The girl learned early on the difference between wanting and needing, between wishing and simply surviving. While other children played with new dolls, she made up stories with torn pieces of cloth, transforming crumbs into entire worlds to escape the emptiness. As a teenager, poverty became even more cruel. Her school uniform was always worn, her sneakers with torn soles, betrayed her condition, and her classmates were unforgiving. Mocking laughter echoed in the hallways. Each insulting nickname reminded her that she didn't belong. Still, she held her head high, cultivating a quiet strength that few noticed. There were nights when she cried in secret, muffling her sobs into her pillow so her mother wouldn't hear. But the next day, she'd leave the house as if she were made of steel. Over time, she discovered that solitude could be a kind of shelter. Without real friends, she learned to trust only herself. This very loneliness, however, was the breach that left her vulnerable. At 17, she met a boy who seemed to offer everything the world had denied her: attention, affection, promises of a better future. But empty promises weigh more heavily than absence, and it didn't take long for her to realize she'd been deceived. The boy disappeared, just like her father, leaving only the weight of a growing belly and the silence of sleepless nights. When she told her mother, she expected a hug, a word of comfort, but received only silence and a distant look. Her exhausted mother had no strength for another fight, and this unexpected pregnancy seemed like the final straw in a cup already brimming with bitterness. Shortly thereafter, her mother also left, not physically but emotionally, as if she had given up on believing in any new beginning. And so she found herself completely alone, carrying within her a life she hadn't yet known, but already loved. With fierce intensity, poverty, once a shadow, became a concrete monster. Nights without dinner, overdue bills, the sidelong glances of neighbors whispering cruel stories about the lonely pregnant girl. And yet, there was a flame within her that refused to be extinguished. Perhaps it was maternal instinct. Perhaps it was the silent faith that God would not abandon her. In her darkest moments, she held her belly and whispered promises to her unborn child. "You will never go through what I went through. I will fight to the end for you." These words were like a prayer and an oath at the same time, sustaining her when everything seemed to be falling apart. The past had shaped her into an invisible armor made of pain, abandonment, and tears, but also of resilience and courage. And it was this force that, without her knowing it, was about to place her at the center of a destiny greater than she could imagine. On that particular day, even before the pregnant young woman boarded the bus, icy venom hung in the air, born of a cruel bet between two young men sitting in the back. They wore designer clothes, carried expensive backpacks, and possessed the kind of arrogance of those who've never had to count pennies to survive. Laughing, one of them issued a challenge. "Want to see how much fun everyone will have if someone tries to get on without paying? I'll bet you $50 that one of those losers shows up today. New York is full of them." The other laughed, looking around as if public transportation were just a stage for his petty cruelties. The tired driver already seemed part of the machine, as if this routine of judging and expelling were natural. For them, someone's humiliation was just a cheap spectacle, almost like a private show. And it was in this poisoned context that the protagonist emerged, hesitant, carrying her belly and her courage, unaware that she had already been chosen as a target before she even attempted to board. The first muffled laugh echoed as she placed her feet on the step, and the second as her trembling hand reached for her empty pockets. The driver's gaze hardened, but the young men in the back were attentive, amused, as if watching a scene scripted for them. "Look, I already won the bet," one of them whispered, discreetly pulling out his wallet and showing the other the folded money. The contempt spread quickly, infecting other passengers who knew nothing of the bet, but sensed the chance to laugh at someone more fragile. A woman whispered something about irresponsibility. A man in a suit frowned in disdain, and even the teenagers, distracted by their cell phones, began filming. hoping to capture a scene worthy of online mockery. The silence was no longer silence. It was a courtroom without a judge, where every look was a sentence and every laugh a condemning hammer. The young woman, unaware of the bet that had made her a target, only felt the weight of growing hostility. Her breathing quickened, her heart pounded against her ribs, and yet she tried to speak. I'll pay later, I just need to get to the hospital. But her words were drowned out by the muffled laughter of the two young men who were now celebrating the victory of their dirty trick. The driver crossed his arms, inflexible, and the crowd waited as if hoping for the cruelest outcome. The scene, which should have been just another ordinary moment on a big city bus, was transformed into an arena of humiliation, fueled by a petty bet that no one but them knew about, but which everyone in some way was helping to sustain. The reason for the shame was set, and the protagonist, alone and vulnerable, had been thrust into the center of a cruel spectacle, never imagining that this would be the day when the logic of life would take an unexpected turn. The heavy silence that had taken over the bus seemed to grow stronger by the second, but it was broken by the sound of firm footsteps crossing the narrow aisle. The well-dressed man, then seated in the middle of the vehicle, stood up and walked toward the front. Eyes turned to him as if a character had just entered a theater scene, changing the plot unexpectedly. His shoes gleamed against the worn floor, his expensive watch reflected the light streaming through the windows, and yet what was most striking was not the luxury, but the unshakable calm that seemed to radiate from his posture. The young woman, motionless before the driver, felt her heart race. She didn't know if this man had come to humiliate her further or simply to walk down the aisle without a care. But when he stopped beside her, the air changed in density. Without raising his voice, he pulled a large bill from his wallet and handed it to the driver, making it clear, "Consider her fare paid, and everyone else's if necessary." The driver, surprised, hesitated for a moment, staring at the money as if unsure what to do. Behind him, the two young men who had initiated the bet looked at each other, disconcerted, as the scene that should have ended in ridicule began to turn into something unexpected. The millionaire didn't look at them, nor at the other passengers. His gaze rested solely on the young woman, and there was something in that gesture that wasn't just charity but silent respect, as if saying without words that she was no less worthy than anyone else on that bus. The young woman, her breath still shaky, tried to speak, but her voice faltered. Her teary eyes betrayed the mixture of shame and gratitude she felt. She didn't want handouts, she didn't want to be seen as weak, but at that moment the help came wrapped in a dignity that didn't diminish her. He then spoke softly, only for her to hear, "No one here has the right to judge you. Keep your head up." That simple, direct sentence pierced her soul like a balm. For the first time in a long time, someone wasn't looking at her with contempt or pity, but with a kind of human recognition she'd forgotten existed. The passengers, previously eager for a spectacle of humiliation, now fell silent in embarrassment. Many averted their eyes, unable to bear the weight of their own judgment. The millionaire, heedless of the crowd, accompanied the young woman to one of the benches. The silence was no longer one of derision but of collective shame. The young men who had set up the bet tried to shrink into the back, as if they wanted to disappear, and the young woman, now sitting with her belly protected in her arms, felt something different. It wasn't just relief at having been defended, but a strange sensation that this man hadn't appeared in her life by chance. The first contact had happened, not with promises or grand gestures, but with the simple force of an action that restored humanity amidst the chaos. For a brief moment, the millionaire's gesture seemed to silence the entire bus, as if dignity had been restored to the pregnant young woman. But the silence soon turned to venomous murmurs. Thanks. Same crowd that had previously reveled in her shame, now writhed in the discomfort of having been disarmed. The money paid didn't erase the cruelty, only made it more evident. "Look, now she even receives handouts," whispered a woman with a hard look, her voice thick with contempt. An older man laughed mockingly, saying loudly enough for everyone to hear, "This child is born in debt. First, the mother doesn't even have enough for a ticket. Then she'll live on handouts for her entire life." The Laughter that echoed after these words was worse than the initial silence, because it carried the weight of a collective judgment. The young woman shrugged, instinctively hugging her belly, as if to protect the baby not only from hunger or poverty, but also from the poison oozing from the people around her. Her teary eyes searched for a fixed point on the ground, as if there she found refuge from the contempt coming from all sides. The young men in the back, authors of the cruel bet, couldn't resist adding more pain to the spectacle. "Hey girl, maybe the millionaire daddy showed up at just the right time, huh? Who knows, maybe he'll take responsibility for the child too," one of them said, laughing derisively, encouraged by the knowing looks of other passengers. The comment pierced the air like a poisoned arrow, and the weight of those words made the young woman tremble, not with fear, but with pent-up rage. She pressed her lips together, refraining from responding, knowing that any word would be turned into ammunition against her. The millionaire, who stood beside her, stared at the young men, and the silence that followed was more menacing than any shout, but the collective contempt had already spread. The simple act of existing, pregnant and poor, had turned her into a target. No matter the noble gesture defending her, the crowd needed someone to crush, to feel superior. It was as if each passenger found in her suffering a mirror to reject their own miseries. "People like her never change," said a woman in the back, crossing her arms bitterly. The comment was echoed by other looks of disapproval. The entire bus seemed to conspire to turn her pain into a spectacle, and the weight of this humiliation was almost unbearable. Yet there was something different about her. Even in tears, even cowering, she didn't completely surrender to the role of victim. What no one realized was that behind that silence was a flame that still burned, and that sooner or later would reveal itself. For now, the public humiliation stung like a hot iron, but it also fueled a silent strength, the same strength that had sustained her life until then. And the millionaire, observing every cruel word, was already beginning to understand that there was more to this young woman than anyone on that bus could have imagined. The bus continued on its way, but the air remained dense, heavy, charged with poison. With every curve, every bump, the young woman felt not only the weight of her belly, but also the weight of the eyes that still judged her. The millionaire, silent, stood beside her, firm, like an invisible wall. The boys in the back chuckled softly, believing they had won, that they had turned the scene into a cheap spectacle. But it was at that moment that something unexpected happened. The young woman slowly raised her head, wiped her tears with the sleeve of her worn blouse, and looked directly at them. Her look was not one of anger nor despair. It was that of someone who knew far more than anyone there imagined. The entire bus seemed to hold its breath. In a firm yet low voice she said, "I know about your bet." The silence that followed was absolute, as if even the engine had stopped to listen. The boys glanced at each other nervously, trying to hide it with laughter, but the blush on their faces betrayed them. "You think I didn't notice?" she continued, staring at them without taking her eyes off them. "Since I got on, I saw them laughing. I saw the money being flashed. I saw them waiting for me to fall so they could all laugh along. And you know what? I'm used to being the target, but today you couldn't break me." Her words pierced the bus like invisible knives. Some passengers, previously complicit in the spectacle, now looked away in shame. The strength of that young woman, who just minutes before seemed crushed, now stood before them with a dignity no one could deny. The young men tried to react. One of them murmured, "You're making it up?" But the uncertainty in his voice betrayed the truth. The millionaire then took a step forward, as if confirming every word with his own presence. "She's not making it up," he said quietly but firmly. "I saw it too." And in that instant, the tables were turned. The young woman was no longer just the victim. She had taken over the narrative. By revealing that she knew everything, that she had observed every detail, she transformed her own humiliation into a public exposure of the true culprits. The weight of shame was no longer on her shoulders but on theirs. The eyes of the bus turned to the boys, and for the first time, the crowd didn't laugh. There was only silence, the kind of silence that condemns more than any words. The young woman took a deep breath, shifted in her seat, and stroked her belly as if reaffirming a silent promise. She had revealed not only that she knew of the cruelty, but also that her pain didn't make her weak. On the contrary, it strengthened her. And as the bus rolled through the cold city streets, a strange feeling hung in the air. Everyone knew something greater was yet to come. The bus moved along the congested avenues, but for the millionaire, time seemed to have slowed down. There was something about that young woman that unsettled him, something beyond her newly revealed courage and the firm gaze that had silenced a crowd. He watched her silently, as if searching her face for traces of a distant memory. Her name hadn't been spoken, but her presence stirred forgotten echoes. When she gently caressed her belly, a detail stuck in his mind. The way she did it wasn't just that of an ordinary mother, but of someone who carried within her a promise of struggle and survival. He had seen that look before, not on her but on someone else. The memory came to him like a flash. A cold night, years ago, at a charity his family used to support. Poor children and teenagers received donations, clothing and meals. He, still young, had been taken by his father to one of these philanthropic visits to learn about social responsibility. There, among so many silent children, stood a girl with sparkling eyes who, even wearing torn clothes, spoke with rare firmness. "I'm going to change my life. No one will tell me who I am." He had never forgotten those words, though at the time he hadn't given them much importance. Now, sitting beside her, the memory burned in his mind. Could that girl be the same young woman now pregnant, facing the whole world on a bus? The doubt became almost certainty when she adjusted the collar of her blouse, discreetly revealing a thin scar on her shoulder. He remembered immediately. That winter night, the same girl had fallen during a fight in the shelter's cafeteria and received a cut, which he himself had helped to staunch with a makeshift cloth. The detail was unmistakable. The millionaire's heart raced, not at the discovery itself, but at the significance. This wasn't just any young woman. She was someone he had seen struggle with pain since childhood, someone who bore the scars of poverty in her body and soul, but also an indomitable strength. He looked away, trying to process what this meant. Fate had once again placed in his path the same person who, years before, had been an example of silent resistance amidst chaos. The young woman, noticing his fixed gaze, raised her eyebrows and murmured, "You're looking at me like you know me." The millionaire hesitated, but the answer escaped in a low, almost inaudible voice, "Because I know you." The tension between them transformed into something denser, almost palpable. The revelation hung in the air, but needed no explanation at that moment. The silence said more than any words, and although no one on the bus was aware of what was happening between them, they both knew that history had just changed course. The bus lurched to a halt at another point in the city, and the young woman took the opportunity to stand. There was something in her eyes that blended firmness and farewell, as if she knew that this encounter had been merely a pause in her struggle, not a new beginning. The millionaire was still processing the revelation, trying to connect her face to the forgotten past of shelters and promises of a different future, when he realized she was about to get off. "Wait," he said, extending his hand, but she only smiled bitterly, as if harboring a secret she doesn't intend to reveal in full. "I don't need anything else," she murmured, her voice low but enough to pierce his chest like a blade. And without looking back, she descended the steps of the bus. The door closed with a sharp click, and the image of her walking along the sidewalk with her belly protected by her arms stuck in his mind like a photograph framed by the dusty window. The bus moved on, but he felt as if he had been left behind, abandoned in the silence of that departure. In the days that followed, the scene replayed in his memory with almost painful detail. The sound of cruel laughter, her courage in confronting the boys, the scar on her shoulder, the short, firm phrase, "I know about your bet." And above all, the way she had disappeared from his life without asking for anything, without accepting anything other than her own dignity. The millionaire, accustomed to controlling everything with money and influence, felt for the first time the weight of his powerlessness. He searched in vain for signs of her. He passed through shelters, institutions supporting single mothers, public hospitals, But the young woman seemed to have dissolved into the city, like a shadow that fate had preserved for itself. Each absence was like a growing emptiness within him. The expensive watch no longer gleamed. The appointments in conference rooms became muffled and colorless. The memory of her had planted a restlessness that eroded his certainties. Who really was this young woman whom life had twice placed in his path? Why, amidst so many faces that crossed his routine, only hers remained etched like a scar in his memory? In the solitude of his luxurious apartments, surrounded by silence and the cold lights of the city that never slept, he began to realize that it wasn't just her absence that tormented him, but the absence of something greater within himself. Life, until then measured by numbers and achievements, revealed itself empty before the memory of a young woman who, without material possessions, carried within her a strength he had never possessed. With each sleepless night, gazing out the window at the illuminated streets, the feeling grew. He wasn't just missing her. He was missing himself, the humanity he had lost over the years, and that only that young woman's steady gaze had rekindled. Her absence still echoed like a void, but the world around her didn't stop. And ironically, it was at the height of his influence that the millionaire felt the weight of his downfall. He was accustomed to being admired at meetings, applauded at conferences, cited in newspapers as an example of success. But it took just one scandal for the masks to fall. A multi-million-dollar contract involving public works was questioned, and suddenly his name was splashed across headlines not as a financial market visionary, but as a suspect of corruption and favoring companies in exchange for political influence. The evidence was still fragile, but the public trial didn't wait for court. Social media became a ruthless arena, and every photo of him at lavish dinners, every video of his appearances at gala events, was now used as ammunition against his image. A man who always thought himself untouchable now has to answer for his own failings, wrote a television commentator. The millionaire who prided himself on his philanthropy may never have known the true value of dignity, said another. The tone of the criticism wasn't just about finances, it was moral. Suddenly, the gazes that had once revered him began to fill him with contempt, and the places where he had once been celebrated became stages of silent humiliation. At a press conference, surrounded by cameras and microphones, he tried to explain himself, but was interrupted by boos from outside. A group of protesters held signs with cutting slogans, "Those who buy dignity don't know what it's like to have it. Money doesn't cleanse the conscience." He looked at those words and felt his heart sink, immediately remembering the pregnant young woman and what she had endured on the bus. The difference was that now he was the target. Karma had turned against him in an almost symbolic way. The man who had already witnessed the humiliation of poverty now experienced the humiliation of public exposure. His partners began to drift away, invitations disappeared, and even the once reverent employees began to avoid him in the hallways, as if his mere proximity could tarnish their reputations. He still had money, but he felt miserable because what he had lost wasn't numbers, but the quiet respect he had once imagined he possessed. It was in this state of decline that he realized the young woman, even poor and pregnant, had faced the crowd with more dignity than he, a millionaire, ever had. And this truth hurt him more than any headline. For the first time in years, he saw money not as a shield, but as a burden, a weight that now sank him before the invisible tribunal of society. The days that followed his downfall were like endless long nights. The millionaire, accustomed to packed schedules and secretaries who barely managed to fit appointments into their routine, now found himself facing an empty calendar. The phone rang less each week, the invitations disappeared, and the doors that once opened automatically now remained locked. It was in this emptiness that the silence became unbearable. At first he tried to resist in any way he knew how. He hired lawyers, held meetings to seek strategies to clear his name, but none of this eased the deepest wound. The realization that his public image was merely a fragile reflection easily shattered. At night, he walked alone through the spacious rooms of his apartment, and each space echoed the sound of his own loneliness. The crystal glasses, the expensive paintings, The custom-made furniture no longer brought him comfort. Everything seemed empty, useless, dead. And in this emptiness, the memory of her emerged with an almost painful force. The young, pregnant woman's firm gaze on the bus, the way she'd revealed her knowledge of the bet, her courage to face everyone in silence. It replayed in his mind like a scene etched in iron. He began to revisit old memories, pulling from within himself memories he'd buried. The girl from the shelter, the scar on his shoulder, the voice that had once echoed with the same force. "I'm going to change my life." He wondered if, at some point, he'd lost his way, and the answer came like an uncomfortable whisper. Yes, he had traded humanity for the illusion of power. Little by little, he began to seek refuge in places he'd previously ignored. He visited churches discreetly, not to be seen, but to hear the hymns that spoke of redemption. He walked the streets without private drivers, just to feel the cold wind on his face and observe ordinary people. He began visiting orphanages and institutions, not to donate exorbitant sums in exchange for headlines, but simply to be there, listening to stories, looking into the eyes of those living on the margins. Every face she encountered seemed to echo her own. She discovered that true transformation lay not in erasing mistakes, but in acknowledging them. For the first time, she understood that dignity wasn't bought with high marks, but built silently, with gestures that needed no audience. Her fall had been brutal, but also necessary. The man staring into the mirror was no longer the same. The suit was still there, the watch still gleamed, but behind them were now different eyes, less haughty, more human. And with each heartbeat, the certainty grew that he needed to find her again. Not to save her, not to redeem himself before her, but because only alongside that silent strength could he learn what it truly meant to live. Their reunion didn't take place in a luxurious room or at a gala dinner, but in a simple setting, almost forgotten by the world. It was a cold afternoon, the sun hiding behind tall buildings, and the city seemed swallowed by a grey melancholy. The millionaire walked the streets of a humble neighborhood, where he now made frequent visits to a small community institution that supported single mothers and vulnerable young people. He wasn't seeking publicity, simply trying to fill the emptiness that accompanied him. It was there, among peeling walls and children running barefoot, that his eyes found her again. She was sitting on a wooden bench, holding a battered folder of documents, probably seeking some help. Her belly was no longer so evident. The baby had been born. A small bundle slept in her arms, wrapped in a worn but clean blanket. His heart raced. Each step toward her felt like crossing an abyss. There was no applause, no audience, only the intense silence of two destinies crossing once again. She saw him, and for a moment her eyes hardened, as if trying to build a wall between them. But soon the wall gave way, not out of fragility, but out of the inevitability of the moment. He stood before her, speechless. The weight of everything that had happened, of all the scornful looks on the bus, of the cruel bet, of her own public downfall, fell over that moment like a veil. "You," she murmured, her voice choked but firm. "Why are you here?" He took a deep breath, his hands trembling, as if finally admitting he no longer had any masks. "Because I couldn't forget. Because I need to learn from you what it means to resist." The silence that followed was more eloquent than any speech. The young woman looked down at the baby in her arms, stroked his sleeping face, and then looked back at him. There were no more tears in her eyes, only a serene clarity, the same clarity of someone who had suffered too much to be easily deceived. The millionaire sat beside her, not daring to touch, simply sharing the space. The children around her played, their light laughter contrasting with the intensity of that encounter, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. There was no past, no future, only the raw presence of two beings who bore different but equally deep scars. He didn't ask for forgiveness, she didn't offer immediate comfort. Their reunion wasn't about words, but about the silent strength that united them, the reminder that dignity can survive even in the cruelest scenarios. And on that simple bench, amidst peeling walls and the distant cries of other children, something invisible began to rebuild itself. Not a perfect life, not a fairy tale fantasy, but the chance to rewrite a destiny the world had tried to erase. The reunion had broken the silence of fate, but the decision could not be postponed. Sitting side by side on that worn wooden bench, she held the baby in her arms as if it were her shield and her strength, while he watched her with eyes that no longer held arrogance, only vulnerability. The millionaire, accustomed to controlling narratives, waited for something he could not buy. Her answer. The air seemed dense, time suspended, as if the entire room awaited the sentence that only she could deliver. She took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the child, and then looked up at him. There was no anger, but there was no tenderness either. What was visible there was the solidity of someone who had endured humiliation and pain without breaking. "You defended me that day on the bus," she began, her voice calm but firm. "But you didn't save me, because I never needed saving. I needed someone to look at me without contempt. And that you did." The millionaire lowered his eyes, feeling the weight of each word. There were no excuses he could offer, only the humility of someone who recognizes his flaws. She continued, "I saw your downfall. I heard people talk. I read your name in the newspapers. You experienced a bit of what I've lived through my entire life, being judged, singled out, condemned without the right to a defense. But the difference is that I didn't have the money to get back on my feet. I had to rely on myself alone." The silence grew even heavier. He wanted to speak, wanted to say that he had changed, that he had learned, but any words would seem fragile compared to her strength. The young woman looked at the baby again, kissed his forehead, and with a serene gesture returned to face the millionaire. "I can forgive the world, I can even forgive myself for the mistakes I've made. But you—" She paused, and in that moment his heart nearly stopped. "You don't need my forgiveness. You need to learn to forgive yourself." He closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the sentence that sounded more like a revelation than a refusal. When he opened them, she was already standing. With the baby in her arms, she tucked the battered briefcase under her free arm and took a few steps toward the institution's door. He watched her motionless, feeling with each movement a piece of himself slip away. But before leaving, she stopped and turned, her gaze steady, serene, almost compassionate. "I don't know if we'll meet again, maybe, maybe not. But if that day comes, I want to find a man who doesn't need applause or fortune to be worthy. Only then, maybe there's something beyond what happened between us." And with that, she disappeared back through the door, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to fill every corner of the room. The millionaire remained seated, feeling that his life had not received a conclusion, but a calling. There was no complete forgiveness, no definitive goodbye. There was only the promise that true transformation was still in his hands. Night had fallen over New York, and the lights of the buildings reflected on the asphalt wet from the recent rain. The millionaire walked alone, without bodyguards, without luxury cars, just a man lost in the anonymous crowd. The cold wind bit his face, but within him was a strange calm, unlike anything he had ever felt. As he crossed a nearly deserted square, he heard children's laughter echoing in the distance. He turned and saw a small group of mothers, each holding their children, chatting amid the swaying trees illuminated by yellowed streetlights. Among them, for a moment, he thought he saw her silhouette, holding the baby to her chest. His heart raced. He took a few steps forward, but the figure disappeared amid shadows and reflections. He stood still, trying to distinguish what was real from what was memory. The wind blew stronger, lifting dry leaves that swirled at his feet, and in that instant, he understood, without words, that perhaps he wouldn't see her again, or perhaps he would, but that no longer mattered. What mattered was what had awakened within him. He stopped before a puddle of water on the ground, and for the first time stared at his own reflection without looking away. He didn't see the businessman, didn't see the millionaire, didn't see the man from the headlines, just a tired, human face with eyes that finally held truth. He lifted his chin and smiled slightly, not at the others, but at himself. And while the city moved on with its usual haste, he remained there, motionless, as if he were just one among so many. But inside him, something had changed forever. If you've made it this far, I want to hear your opinion. What would you do in her place? Comment below, I'll read every answer. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and click on the video that's currently playing on your screen. I'm sure it will captivate you as much as this one.